Of the year 33 AD, it may possibly have been recorded in the diaries of certain Roman businessmen that there was a disturbance in the remote province of Judea, a tumult quickly quelled by the energy of His Excellency Pontius Pilate, the governor, who seized and crucified one Christos, the chief malcontent, and two bandits, his accomplices. It is more probable, however, that they only remembered this year as marking one of the severest panics which ever shook the foundations of Roman credit. As with most panics, the causes of this were not obvious. About a year before, the firm of Seuths and Son of Alexandria lost 3 richly laden spice ships on the Red Sea in a hurricane. Their ventures in the Ethiopian caravan trade also were unprofitable, ostrich feathers and ivory having lately fallen in value. It soon began to be rumored that they might be obliged to suspend. A little later, the well-known purple house of Malchus and Company, centered at Tyre, but with factories at Antioch and Ephesus, suddenly became bankrupt, a strike among their Phoenician workmen, and the embezzlements of a trusted freedman manager being the direct causes of the disaster. Presently, it became evident that the great Roman banking house of Quintus Maximus and Lucius Vivo had loaned largely to both Seuths and Malchus. The depositors, fearing for their money, commenced a run on the bank, and distrust spread because men experienced on the Via Sacra, the first-century Wall Street, said that the still larger house of the brothers Petius was also involved with Maximus and Vivo. The two threatened establishments might still have escaped disaster had they been able to realize on their other securities. Unfortunately, the Petits had placed much of their depositors' capital in loans among the noblemen of the Belgia in North Gaul. In quiet times, such investments commanded very profitable interest. But an outbreak among that semi-civilized people caused the government to decree a temporary suspension of processes for debt. The Petits were therefore left with inadequate resources. Maximus and Vivo closed their doors first, but that same afternoon the Petits did likewise. Grave rumors obtained that, owing to the interlacing of credits, many other banks were affected. Still, the crisis might have been localized had not a new and more serious factor been introduced. In a laudable desire to support the Italian agricultural interest, then in a most declining way, the Senate, with the assent of Tiberius, the emperor, had ordered 1/3 of every senator's fortune to be invested in lands within Italy. Failure to comply with the ordinance invited prosecution and heavy penalties. The time allowed for readjustment had almost expired, when many rich senators awoke to the fact that they had not made the required relocation of their fortunes. To find capital to buy land, it was necessary for them to call in all their private loans and deposits at the bankers. Publius Spinter, a wealthy nobleman, particularly was obliged to notify Balbus and Ollius, his bankers, that they must find the 30 million sesterces he had deposited with them 2 years before. 2 days later, Balbus and Ollius had closed their doors, and their bankruptcy was being entered before the praetor. The same day, a notice in the Acta Diurna, the official gazette posted daily in the Forum, told how the great Corinthian bank of Leucippus, Leucippus's sons, had gone into insolvency. A few days later, it was heard that a strong banking house in Carthage had suspended. After this, all the surviving banks on the Via Sacra announced that they must have timely notice before paying their depositors. The safe arrival of the corn fleet from Alexandria caused the situation at the capital to brighten temporarily. But immediately afterward came news that 2 banks in Lyon were rearranging their accounts, as the euphemism ran. Likewise, another in Byzantium. From the provincial towns of Italy and the farming districts, where creditors had long allowed their loans to run at profitable interest, but were now suddenly calling in their principals, came cries of keen distress and tidings of bankruptcy after bankruptcy. After this, nothing seemed able to check the panic at Rome. One bank closed after another. The legal 12% rate of interest was set at naught by any man lucky enough to possess ready money. The praetor's court was crowded with creditors demanding the auctioning of the debtors' houses, slaves, warehouse stock, or furniture. The auctions themselves were thinly attended, for who could buy? Valuable villas and racing studs were knocked down for trifles. Caught in the disaster, many men of excellent credit and seemingly ample fortune were reduced to beggary. The calamity seemed spreading over the empire and threatening a stoppage of all commerce and industry, when Gracchus, the praetor, before whom the majority of the cases in bankruptcy came, at his wits' end to decide between the hosts of desperate debtors and equally desperate creditors, resorted to the Senate House, whence, after a hurried debate, the conscript fathers dispatched a fast messenger with a full statement of the danger to their lord and master Tiberius in his retreat at Capri. While the Caesar's reply was awaited, the business world of the capital held its breath. 4 days after the dispatch from the Senate, an imperial courier came pricking back from Campania. The Senate assembled in the Curia with incredible celerity. A vast throng, slaves and millionaires, elbowing together, filled the forum outside, while the emperor's letter was read, first to the Senate, then from the open rostrum to the waiting people. Tiberius had solved the problem with his usual calm good sense. The obnoxious decrees were for the time to be suspended. 100 million sests were to be taken from the imperial treasury and distributed among reliable bankers, to be loaned to the neediest debtors, no interest to be collected for 3 years, but security was to be offered of double value in real property. The law being laxed and the most pressing cases cared for by the government loan, private lenders began to take courage and offer money at reasonable rates. Dispatches from Alexandria, Carthage, and Corinth indicated that the panic had been stayed in those financial centers. The moneyed world of the Via Sacra began to resume its wonted aspect. A few banking houses and individuals never recovered from their losses, but the majority escaped permanent suspension, and so the panic of the consulship of Galba and Sulla, i.e. of 33 AD, passed into half-forgotten history. Such, a little expanded from Tacitus and Suetonius, is the tale of the great panic under the third Caesar. A narrative like this would have no verisimilitude unless placed in a society extending over seas and continents, with a great internal and foreign commerce, rapid means of communication, complex and vast credit transactions, an elaborate system of banking, in other words, with conditions not unlike many of these of the 20th century. Great was the Roman Empire, in its military glory, its system of law and administration, its preservation of the artistic and intellectual heritage from Greece, its elimination of clan patriotism and local prejudices. But it was also great in that it fostered the development of an economic life such as has not come again to the world until very recent times. It is of this Roman commerce, communication, banking, credit, and of society largely founded on such a money basis that we propose to write. With us, the most reverend majesty is that of riches, even though, foul lucre, thou dwellest in no temple, and we have not reared altars to coin, as we have for the worship of peace and faith, victory, virtue, and concord. Thus, the satirist Juvenal writes 150 years after the Roman Republic had become the Roman Empire. He might have written the same words in praise of the Sanctissima Divitiarum Majestas, whether he had lived in the days of Cicero or in those of Theodosius I. Claudian and Ammianus Marcellinus give ample witness that the scramble after wealth, honest or fraudful, the tricks of the legacy hunter, the client, the parasite, lasted down to the last glitter of the empire. At all ages of Rome, after the Republic went forth conquering and to conquer, this love for mammon existed, and we can discover it almost at its worst 100 years before Julius Caesar toppled down the decayed edifice of the Republic. The Roman seemingly was, in all his business relations, more devoid of sentiment than the most abused Semite. He was in money matters either oppressor or oppressed, either hammer or anvil. In his private life, his sympathies extended only to a very narrow circle of associates. His instincts as a moral being were always subordinate to his instincts as a financier, and a financier whose code was that of unmitigated commercialism. If he kept his old Latin religion, and with the spread of Greek philosophy in Italy, it is likely he did not. He regarded the gods as he did his customers and commercial correspondents. He gave so much in prayer and sacrifice, in return for which he expected a given amount of favor. If the divine favor was not forthcoming, heaven had broken its contract, and it was a misfortune that the faithless God could not be brought into court to be compelled to make good his promise or refund the offering. The average Roman, indeed, realized that from a selfish standpoint, honesty was the best policy, even if his honesty was usually of a deplorably narrow and literal kind. Nevertheless, the love of gain and of the enjoyments which followed gain too often blunted his vision utterly and made him a harsh father, an unfilial son, a faithless husband, a brutal master, a corrupt citizen. At his best, a Roman could rise to the heights of civic and personal virtue. At his worst, he could show examples of avarice, cruelty, and vice to the basest peoples he had conquered. To what a condition the gilded youth of Rome could come was well shown during the great proscription conducted by the second triumvirs, 43 B.C. One Tauranus, an ex-praetor, had been denounced. He pleaded with the centurion, come to slay him, to delay until his son, a favorite of Marcus Antonius, could beg him mercy. He has already appealed, laughed the officer, but on the other side. The son, in other words, had sought the reward offered the betrayers of the proscribed. The old man called for his daughter, begged her not to claim her share of the inheritance after he was dead, or her brother would ask for her life too, then submitted to his doom. The causes which made tragedies like this possible lie outside the scope of this volume. Whether the Romans would have continued chaste, honest, and simple, had they never spread their dominions beyond Italy, is a question no historian can answer. I do not know, writes Florus, whether it would have been better for the Roman people to have been content with Sicily and Africa, or even to have been without them, while still enjoying Italy, than to grow to such greatness as to be ruined by their own strength. For what else produced those intestine distractions but excessive good fortune? And he adds that it was the conquest of Asia from Antiochus, the Syrian, presently followed by the annexation of the kingdom of Pergamus, which brought this special havoc in the old-time morality and simplicity. It is perfectly certain that in the 2nd century BC, the Romans changed from a people predominantly agricultural to one predominantly commercial. The change, as will be explained in later chapters, wrought grievous harm to Italy, and ultimately to the whole world. The ruling Roman classes ceased to ask how much they could get out of the soil and asked how much they could get out of their subjects. The Forum and the basilicas around it became a regular stock exchange. The most influential men in the state were directly or indirectly the speculators. A few steps from his banker's stalls brought the Roman nobleman to the Curia, where as an august senator he and his class handed down decrees enforced by the legions upon Syria or Spain. The commercial motives in public policy were often highly obvious. Corinth and Carthage were both destroyed in 146 BC. Both were dangerous commercial and financial rivals. The fear of Carthaginian moneylenders competing with Roman moneylenders was at least equal to the dread of the rise of a second Hannibal. The removal of these great cities drove capital to Rome more than ever before. Her only real commercial equal was now Alexandria, and Alexandria was remote, and circumstances made her more an ally than an enemy of the money kings by the Tiber. The process of commercializing the Romans, which had begun probably before the Second Punic War, went on through the later Republic, and reached a climax in the age of Augustus. By that time, the old noble families had largely run out. Their scions, who had not earned but had inherited riches, were more anxious for spending than for getting. Luxury and squandering rose to ever greater excesses, and culminated under Nero. After him, several things began to produce a reaction. The emperors undertook to set a more frugal example. The Stoic philosophy and, more slowly, Christianity began to establish other ideals than those of getting and enjoying. The high-born families who had amassed the riches had nearly all died out, thanks to a childlessness caused by luxurious living, and to the slaughters of the civil wars and of the tyrants. And property was passing into the hands of ex-slaves and provincials who had a juster knowledge of the use of riches. Unfortunately, the leaven that had begun to work among the Roman upper classes during the Republic had spread into the whole social lump. The ex-slaves and subject nations had now learned, if not before, to worship the golden god so eagerly invoked by their masters. Under the empire, the forms and expressions of the commercial spirit changed in some detail from those under the Republic. The underlying essence was the same. Money continued to be the leading power in the world until the coming of the barbarians and of Christianity. To justify the broad generalizations of the preceding paragraphs, it will be necessary to examine the influence of money upon the forms of human interest and activity usual in the Roman age. By the Roman age is meant the last century of the Republic and the first 2 centuries of the Empire. We are not concerned with the Romans while they were purely an Italian power, before they became the dominators and finally actual masters of the ancient world. Again, when we pass too far beyond the age of the Antonines, we find forces intruding themselves into the empire that are distinctly alien to the genius of ancient society. We have nothing to do with the economic development of the early church or with the institutions of the invading barbarians, although occasionally a reference to conditions in the 3rd, 4th, or 5th centuries will be illuminating. On the other hand, to understand how the money power stretched its tentacles over society, one must examine many things apart from mere financiering. One must ask how the money power affected marriage, home life, slavery, the getting and holding of public office. One must examine ancient benevolence and its tendencies. In short, the question must be, how did money or the sense of money affect the relations of man to man? Thus, there need be no apologies for discussions that seem to touch only slightly on the fortunes of Crassus and the poverty of Mainz. If a state becomes thoroughly commercialized, this fact will probably betray itself in the public life. It will be increasingly difficult for officials to quit office with clean hands. The receipt of what is today called graft will affect both magistrates and citizens. If this tendency to make the public loss the private gain is not ultimately checked, it is likely there will be needed some violent change in the structure of government by which political bribery and corruption will be left less opportunity for their sinister work. Not all the evils that cursed the dying Roman Republic were due to this illicit passing of money. Not a few of the oligarchs who did their best to make the rule of the Roman Senate intolerable went through their public careers without directly filching, or unlawful receiving a denarius. This can be said of Cato Minor, of Cicero, of a good many more. On the other hand, Julius Caesar, the founder of the better regime of the empire, would undoubtedly have assented to Walpole's alleged maxim that all men have their price. He bought up votes and opposing statesmen shamelessly, witnessed his purchase of Curio, and probably the other leaders of the Democratic Party were no more free from malpractices than their senatorial opponents. But the direct influence of money upon elections in the comitia, upon questions of policy in the Senate, or upon the relations of Rome with foreign princes, commenced almost as soon as Rome became a great power, and hardly ended when the empire dissolved the phantom of a free republic. And even under the Caesars, who shall say that the bribe to the prominent palace official, the confidential freedman's secretary, did not often have as great effect on the public weal as the direct purchase of so many thousand curites in the comitia of the days of Pompeius? The Second Punic War, that gigantic contest which actually decided the destinies of the ancient world, gave opportunity for the rich men of the Republic, as well as for its soldiers, to display their patriotism. On one occasion, when the government was in the most direful financial straits, the Roman moneyed classes came forward with a large loan to replenish the empty treasury, on no other security than a bare promise to repay when the government had the money, while other companies undertook the public works which had been suspended, and told the bankrupt state they would expect repayment when the war was over. Such exhibitions of disinterested patriotism were seldom afterwards called for. From the day when the great war indemnity wrung out of Carthage began to fill the Roman treasury, whatever else the Senate's government lacked, it seldom lacked money. The public service, especially the foreign service, with its chances for the plunder of conquered kings, the loot of conquered cities, the gifts of trembling Asiatics and Greeklings, was no longer likely to cost the general or praetor a farthing. On the contrary, he was an exceptional man if he laid down his unsalaried office without being far wealthier than when he took it up. In 171 BC occurred the first case of a Roman official, a commissioner to Illyria, taking bribes from a foreign potentate, an example only too eagerly followed by the succeeding generations, until the scandals culminated in Jugurtha's bribery of a large fraction of the actual rulers of Rome, 111 BC, and his memorable words as he cast his eyes backward when quitting the sovereign city. Urbem venalem et mature perituram, si emptorem invenerit. Unfortunately for Jugurtha, he did not possess treasures enough to purchase all his enemies, and he discovered too late that there were limits at Rome beyond which even gold could not carry him. But while bribery was often a determining factor in the Republic's foreign relations, the influence of money was equally decisive upon home politics. A great noble craved office to enrich himself by a war, an embassy, a governorship. An Italian farmer craved a franchise more humbly to fatten on the favors handed him for electing the great noble to office. The results were almost inevitable. The abuses of the ambitus, the canvassing for election, were patent to the Roman fathers before the city ceased to be a weak commonwealth. The custom of a candidate's walking around the forum, saluting the farmers come to trade and asking their votes was not to be supplemented by adventitious helps. Thus, in 432 BC, a law forbade such candidates from wearing a conspicuous white dress to attract attention. In 358 BC, they were forbidden to go about on market days when the people would be especially thronged together. These laws appeared to be sufficient for nearly 2 centuries. Then it seemed that their edge needed to be sharpened. In 181 BC, a new law declared that persons convicted of illicit canvassing should be ineligible as candidates for 10 years. Here matters were again allowed practically to sleep. While the laws themselves insufficient, considering the highly organized party system developing at Rome, were more honored in the breach than in the observance. Finally, in the last 2 decades of the Republic, the trading in votes rose to such a height that the law was repeatedly strengthened, though, it would seem, to deplorably little purpose. By an act of 67 BC, the treating of voters was made punishable. In 63 BC, the year of Cicero's consulship, the penalty for violating this act was set at 10 years of exile. It was also forbidden to candidates to give any public games for the 2 years previous to standing for office, or to hire persons to attend them while they made their rounds of vote-seeking. In 55 BC, a new law struck at what was probably the most flagrant form of corruption, a form that to an American has a painfully familiar aspect. The wealthy candidate would quietly arrange for his election to the desired office with a band of political go-betweens, interpretes. These professional gentlemen would proceed to mark out the Roman tribes into smaller and more widely wieldy sections, arrange the voters into clubs and fraternities, compound with each section for its votes, marshal the faithful henchmen to the electoral comitia, and duly pay over the stipulated honorarium upon delivery of the election. The details of such arrangements were, it may be imagined, seldom committed to writing. We are left to guess at the workings of these voters' collegia by a few hints from Cicero. It is sufficient to remark that under the late Republic almost any man of noble family and deep purse seems to have been able to rise fairly high in the scale of offices, provided he was willing to spend freely. In times of great excitement, to be sure, mere money might fail to prevail against an approved party leader, but the latter, it can be assumed, would himself hardly prove niggardly. The law of 55 BC declared these voters' collegia unlawful, and arranged special methods for trying offenders against the election statutes. That this new law was ineffectual is shown by still another act in 52 BC against political clubs, making the penalties still heavier. Soon after this came the Caesarean regime, and elections became mere registrations of the will of Julius Caesar, and later of the triumvirs. Under Augustus, a modicum of freedom returned to the electoral comitia, and that the old methods were being pursued and the old evils returning is shown by the law of 18 BC, which required a candidate, before beginning his canvass, to deposit 100 sesterces as security that he would keep the laws. With the death of Augustus, however, and the transfer of the elections by Tiberius from the Comitia to the Senate, election bribery practically ceased to be a crime. At least if a Roman father was open to a gratuity from a candidate, the consideration would be conveyed in a way too delicate for the law to find an entrance. It would be easy to present details of the venality of the Roman government during the later Republic. The notorious case, 61 BC, of the trial of Clodius for sacrilege, when 31 judges out of 56 voted him not guilty of a crime all knew he had committed, is a good instance of the way gold could blind the eyes of Roman Judases. The manner in which the infamous Egyptian king Ptolemaeus Auletes bought the friendship of the Senate in 58 BC was almost as glaring as the bribery by Jugurtha. Too often the person to buy was not the voter or the influential party leader, but the party leader's mistress. This was true in the instance of the concubine of that Verres, whose knaveries were immortalized by Cicero, and of Precia, the mistress of Cethegus, a powerful tribune, whose favor was necessary to Lucullus when he wished the Sicilian province. The gifts an Asiatic prince might be expected to send a Roman general and his staff can only be compared to the fortunes acquired by the Anglo-Indian nabobs in the days of Clive and Hastings. Even petty potentates would pay richly for the privilege of keeping life and power. Thus Aristobulus, a Jewish prince, sent Pompeius a golden vine worth 500 talents. He gave a legate, a. Gabinius, 300, a quaestor, 400 talents. Ptolemaeus Menai, lord of a robber state in Lebanon, bought immunity for himself from Pompeius for 1,000 talents, which, with unusual honesty for a Roman general, Pompeius used to pay his troops. Ariobarzanes of Cappadocia paid the same conqueror 33 talents monthly, which, however, did not reach to the interest on his debts. Gabinius, again, while proconsul of Syria, pressed out of the province 400 million sesterces. Finally, Crassus the rich is said to have taken from the temple of Jerusalem treasure worth 10,000 talents. These great hoards, however, could not, in the nature of things, come to every general and governor. These had a far more reliable mine in the regular pickings which all Roman officials could find among the rich and unfortunate subject populations in their provinces.